A recent poll shows more than half of Ontario motorists admitted to engaging in unsafe driving behaviors. The survey conducted by CAA South Central Ontario says this number increases to 61% amongst young drivers aged 18 to 34. Of those surveyed, the most common dangerous driving behavior admitted to was speeding, followed by distracted driving, then unsafe lane changes. Those surveyed say they witnessed others speeding most often, followed by unsafe lane changes and aggressive driving. And joining us now is Michael Stewart, Community Relations Consultant for CAA South Central Ontario, and he has more on the survey results. Thank you so much for joining us. Well, we went through a lot of that here, but I mean, 55% of Ontario drivers admitted to engaging in dangerous driving behaviors. That's a lot of people. What else did you find?
Thank you so much for having me, Lena. Yes, we did find in this survey it was 55% of Ontario drivers admitted to engaging in these unsafe driving behaviors. But what's a bit concerning for us is when we asked drivers what behaviors they saw, those percentages increased drastically. So we do believe there's a bit of an underrepresentation in drivers admitting which behaviors they engaged in, whether that being they didn't want to admit they engaged in them or what their behavior, they didn't deem it as dangerous. But we do think, unfortunately, that 55% is an underrepresentation.
Right. So just to clear that up, a lot of people said, yes, okay, I admit I engaged in dangerous driving behavior. But even more people said they witnessed dangerous driving behaviors. What kind of behaviors did they see? What made up that list?
Correct. And a lot of those behaviors that drivers saw were actually the behaviors you listed earlier when it came to behaviors that drivers engaged in. So speeding, unsafe lane changes, distracted driving, aggressive driving, running red lights. Those were all behaviors that drivers were seeing pretty frequently on our roads. But that, for example, I'll talk about running red lights. We had 56% of Ontario drivers who said they had seen that on our roads, but then only about 7% admitted to doing that. So that right there is a big discrepancy in the data, and that's why we believe that some of these numbers of the behaviors that people engaged in were a bit underrepresented. Right. So we want to remind all drivers just to follow the rules of the road and keep yourself and others safe.
Yeah, and the number's even more concerning when you're looking at younger drivers. Isn't that right, Michael?
Correct. That 55% does jump up to 61% when we look at those drivers aged 18 to 34. And these are younger drivers. Perhaps they're still getting used to the rules of the road and getting used to being out on the road on their own for the first time, depending on whether they have their G2 or full G license. But we want to remind them that the rules of the road still apply to them. I know when we're younger, we tend to be a bit more riskier, but behind the wheel is not the place to be risky and engage in any form of risky behavior. You want to make sure that you're following the rules and keeping yourself and others safe.
Right. And you're also finding that Ontario drivers, some of them at least, are okay with stiffer penalties for dangerous driving. Can you tell me more about that? And is there any advice for someone who just doesn't know how to put down the phone or stop speeding or engaging in other kinds of unhealthy driving behaviors?
We did have quite a few drivers that did say in our survey that they do support increased penalties, especially for repeat offenders. That's where a lot of that support came in. But then when we asked them, okay, well, do the penalties actually impact your behavior? What was good was we had an increase to 35% of drivers who said that the penalties actually impacted their behavior in this past year, which is good. And I want to remind everyone that the penalties for any of these behaviors, you won't enjoy them. Stunt driving specifically, you're looking at an immediate 30-day license suspension, an immediate 14-day vehicle impoundment, a minimum fine of $2,000, and you could potentially get 6 demerit points too if convicted. And even if you're speeding at lower speeds, so I know there's a common misconception that it's okay to go 10 or 20 over the speed limit, but even just 1 kilometer over the speed limit can still result in a fine. You're looking at about $3 per kilometer for the first 20 kilometers over the speed limit, and then it increases more and more from there. And even at 16 kilometers or more over the speed limit, you're starting to look into demerit points and harsher penalties. So these penalties are not worth the risk, and it's important to follow the rules of the road. And hopefully, if you're following the rules, you'd never have to experience these penalties.
Some really important reminders. Michael Stewart with the CAA. Thank you so much for chatting with us and breaking down these results. We appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.